Good evening and welcome to Economy 2.0, brought to you by the Silvio Gesell Foundation and the Henry George School. My name is Josh Sidman. I want to apologize in advance for my voice today. I'm dealing with what I think is tonsillitis. I didn't want to cancel and reschedule, so I'm just going to try to power through. I feel fine. I just sound weird. Before we get started, I want to mention our upcoming episodes. As I mentioned last time, going forward, we'll be doing 2 episodes a month on the first and third Tuesdays of each month. Start times will vary depending on the locations of the guests. Our next episode is on Tuesday, January 21st at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. We'll feature Stef Kuipers, a Belgian economist and systems engineer who's developing a new proposed model for a monetary system incorporating both demurrage and universal basic income. And then on Tuesday, February 4th at 1 p.m., we'll be joined by Will Ruddick, a former Stanford particle physicist who has turned his attention to community currency systems in Africa. Will is the founder of Grassroots Economics, an organization which has pioneered an alternative exchange model called commitment pooling, which he has used to set up local exchange systems in over 100 communities throughout Kenya. Just a reminder, anyone in the live Zoom audience is welcome to join the conversation. If you have something you'd like to say, please hit the raise hand button under the React tab on your Zoom toolbar. If you have your camera turned on, I'll add you to the screen when it's your turn. Otherwise, we'll just hear your voice. Also, I'll mention that I'm unable to monitor the chat. So if you have something to say, raise your hand and join the conversation that way. Okay, as I usually do, I'd like to say a few words about the series. In the 17 years or so that I've been working to promote the ideas of Silvio Gesell, I've come to believe a few things. First, I believe that the economic and political institutions that govern our lives are leading us off a cliff. I believe the system which is upheld by those institutions is ossified and corrupt and incapable of meaningful reform. I don't believe in incrementalism, that is to say, working within the system to effect change at the margin. I think the time for that has passed. The challenges we face are bigger than what can be addressed through incremental reform. So my focus is on working outside of the existing political and economic systems to fundamentally reconsider the foundations of society and the economy from the ground up. One of the main features of our modern economy is a highly advanced division of labor. The division of labor is the idea that we can all enjoy a higher standard of living by working together and specializing in specific areas of economic activity, rather than working separately and independently to provide for all of our material needs. The division of labor is an enormously powerful economic engine. It's the reason for most of the wealth that exists on Earth today. But it's also a double-edged sword, because it means that almost no one is capable of providing themselves with all of the things they need in order to live. Adopting the division of labor means that we put our very survival in the hands of the community. That means that our lives depend on the continued functioning of existing systems of production and exchange. If those systems ever stopped working, it would be an existential threat for billions of people. So if, like I have, one comes to the conclusion that our existing systems of economy and governance cannot continue to function indefinitely, and that systemic collapse is possible or even probable, what can we do about it? How can we prepare ourselves for a future in which the systems that sustain our lives may not continue to function in the way they have in the past? I've spent a lot of time thinking about that question. As a believer in the economic perspective of Silvio Gesell, an idea I've been thinking about for several years is to develop a model for the creation of alternative economic systems based on Gesell's proposals. one that can be deployed at a local community level, one which can function alongside the conventional economy for as long as that system continues to work, and which can potentially serve as a lifeboat if or when that system stops working. As I've talked to people about this idea, I've realized that there are a lot of other people who are thinking along similar lines. The idea of building lifeboats, of creating alternative models for building community and economy, is something that a lot of people are thinking about these days, and there are a lot of different ideas about how to do it. That was the impetus for the creation of this series, to create a forum where those people can connect, share ideas, debate, and maybe even collaborate. An important and obvious question that arises if one wishes not just think about, but to actually implement such alternative models is where to do it. At this point in history, there's no longer any unclaimed land where pioneers can exit established systems and go elsewhere in order to try out new ideas. A couple hundred years ago, that was possible. Today, it's not. All of the land on Earth has been claimed. So anyone who wants to try to build an alternative model has to do so within the borders of existing countries. That is, unless they want to try something like building floating platforms out in the middle of the ocean, something we'll actually talk about shortly. As an advocate for the ideas of Silvio Gesell, one of the most famous real-world experiments where alternative economic ideas were put into practice was conducted during the Great Depression in a small town in Austria. Many of you are probably familiar with the so-called miracle of Virgil. This tiny town with about 4,000 inhabitants created a local currency based on Gesell's ideas in order to stimulate their economy, which had been hit very hard by the Depression. In the 13 months during which the experiment was going on, the results were extremely encouraging and attracted the attention of the entire world. Leaders from over 100 other municipalities flocked to Virgil to learn about the experiment with the idea of replicating it in their towns. Even the Premier of France visited the town, and the most famous American economist of the time, Irving Fisher, wrote a book and tried to get the US Congress to adopt the idea. Unfortunately, the experiment also drew the attention of the Austrian Central Bank, which saw the project as a threat and shut it down. And this is a pattern that has been repeated elsewhere whenever people have tried to put Gesell's ideas into practice. And this is a challenge that today's guest has spent his career dealing with. Let me bring him in now. Patri Friedman is the founder of Pronomos Capital, a venture capital fund specializing in building experimental cities built on new economic and governance systems. He's been working on related things since at least 2008, when he co-founded the Seasteading Institute with funding from Peter Thiel. That organization was dedicated to the idea I just mentioned, building floating structures in international waters for the purpose of putting alternative models into practice outside of national boundaries. Since that time, Patri has participated in a number of innovative projects, including an experimental community in Honduras called Prospera, which I hope we'll hear more about today. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention Patri's famous grandfather, Milton Friedman, a Nobel Prize winning economist and one of the most influential thinkers of the 20th century on the subject of monetary economics, something I also hope we'll have a chance to talk about today. So Patri, welcome to Economy 2.0. If you don't mind, please take a few minutes to tell us about your path. How did you go from writing code at Google to being a pioneer in the field of charter cities and alternative economic and governance models?
Thanks, Josh. Thanks for having me. It's a very strange industry to be interested in. I did kind of take the common path of the frustrated consumer who wants a product that doesn't exist. And the product that I wanted was a government that matched my values and that had a decent level of customer service. I'm a libertarian, and like many people, libertarian or not, the US doesn't particularly match my values. They, go and waste money on stupid, pointless wars and lock people up for what plants they eat. So there's a lot I identify with about America, but it didn't really feel like a fit. Um, After I graduated college, I was kind of like, I don't know, I want to live in a society that fits my values. And then there's the quality of service. I can go into any store in basically any mall in America and get way better service than I get from the DMV or most government agencies. And so I got kind of curious about this. At first, I was like, oh, maybe it's just this country. And I went and traveled the world and found like, no, there's some countries with better and lower quality of service and with different value sets. But kind of overall, there was no country that really matched my values. And in the vast majority of cases, the quality of service was super low. And I got curious about this. And I started thinking like, why is this? And, naturally with my economics background, in addition to my grandfather, my dad, David Friedman, is or was a professor of law and economics, as well as one of the creators of an alternative political system called anarcho-capitalism. And so I thought with the tools of economics, I said, well, what if we think about government as an industry? What characteristics does it have? One of those characteristics is that the cost of switching is very high. It's much easier for me to change my car insurance or my cell phone carrier than my country. And another problem it has is that the barrier to entry, meaning how much does it take to create a new firm? And the barrier to entry, it's not just high, it's like it's undefined. There is no recognized path to creating a new country, although one has been created about once a year since World War II, but there's no clear path and it's extremely difficult. And what I love about this view is it made me realize, kind of separate from any particular political beliefs that any of us might have, like about a particular system that we want to see tried or what structures we think work better. Of course, an industry where you can't start new companies and it's super hard to switch companies is going to be terrible. Like it has no startup sector, it has very little competition. So we should actually expect it to do a terrible job for these purely structural reasons. And this suggests some solutions. One of them is if we can make a way for people to start new social, political, and legal systems, create a startup sector for government so that all the different people, like your community and many other alternative communities, can actually put into practice and see if their ideas work better, then we can improve the whole industry. And, at first I was kind of focused on like, oh, I want my like libertopia. But I quickly realized it's not about like my particular vision. I could be totally wrong about what makes a good society. If I can change the world so that people can start them, as long as some people are right, then we'll find some better ways of doing things. And, I think that those of us who are interested in making replacements for kind of the 20th century legacy systems, like whether or not we agree on what those replacements should be, like surely we can all agree that we damn well better start trying to build this new stuff. And keep it high level, but just to say like V1 of this was seasteading. This is the idea of building floating cities, cruise ship communities, things like this. The reason for seasteading, as Josh mentioned, all land is claimed. And the way that sovereignty works on the ocean is that each ship registers with a country's flag registry and they fly their flag. And when that ship is out past 12 nautical miles, then, except for taking resources, but whatever happens on the ship is under the jurisdiction of that country. So it's like competitive market for franchising sovereignty. Like if we had this, if towns in the US could like pick register with a county and counties could register with a state, heck, if states could register with a different country, then like my work would be done. We'd actually have experimentation and competition. And this is actually true on the ocean. So that was neat. And one great thing about seasteading is that it was an incredible meme. I mean, you got games like BioShock and Brink. The idea got a ton of press. It got millions of people thinking like, hey, why can't we start new countries? Kind of like peak seasteading meme was when the Colbert Report did a segment, Wealth Under Siege, making fun of us. They said, finally, a community as far away from shore as libertarians are from reality. Um, And but ultimately the ocean is a very difficult and expensive place. And I started working on these ideas in 2001. I got funding from Peter to start the institute in 2008. And then in 2011, Honduras created this first of its kind program, kind of taking an idea from Nobel Prize winning economist Paul Romer called Charter Cities, which he proposed in 2009, although Honduras's version was a bit different. And they made a program in their constitution where private companies could apply to the government in conjunction with a public secretary who represented the people and apply to run a zone called a ZEDA, where they follow the Honduran constitution and treaties and the Honduran criminal law, but they have wide latitude to write all commercial law. And for people who aren't familiar with the difference, just think everything that's not a crime. So this is everything from medical regulation, financial markets, zoning, building codes, labor law, family law, contract law, corporate law, all of that is commercial law. So this was super exciting, and I started working with Honduras in 2011. I had to stop because it just took them a lot of years to get the program up and running. I mean, this is a country trying to do something really groundbreaking, and it, took a while to get it right. But the first Zeta Honduras Prospera opened on the island of Roatan in 2020. So it's been operating for 5 years now. There's a couple other smaller Zetas on the mainland. And I now run an investment fund called Pronomos Capital, which invests in these projects around the world, primarily in Africa, but we have projects working in Asia and South America and other places. So, that's kind of what I do is a 20 plus year journey from being on some Yahoo Groups mailing lists, talking about floating cities and new countries to, now get to negotiate with heads of state every now and then. So it's been quite a ride.
Fascinating. And of course, we want to hear more about all of that. The $64,000 question when it comes to actually implementing experimental governance and economic systems is how to insulate them from interference of governmental entities that hold
Yes.
power in the areas where those experiments are put into practice. Um, I
I have a lot to say
assume,
about that.
right. I assume that that was one of the main reasons for the idea of seasteading. Um, Presumably, anytime anyone tries something like this, it's automatic that it's going to come onto the radar screen of governments and likely elicit a negative response. Um, and I would think that the more successful they are, the more likely that becomes. Um, so I do want to move sort of from beginning to the present. So I'd like to sort of stay with seasteading for a little while, and then move on to what you've been doing more recently. Um, it's my understanding that you are no longer connected with the Seasteading Institute. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. I left the board a few years ago since
Okay,
I've been focusing totally on charter cities, and we don't see eye to eye about kind of what the most practical path forward is right now.
understood. It's
But I would say that in both cases, this question you raised about governments is that both seasteading and charter cities is not trying to invent any kind of new legal regime. I mean, within it, it is, but I mean the way that the container is structured isn't. So in the case of seasteading, it's using the law of the sea, which I think is the largest multilateral convention in the world, meaning it's the treaty with the most countries signing it, the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. And this admiralty law principle of the flag is well established for many centuries, renegotiated many times over the last 100 years. And so we're kind of operating within existing law. Like it's the right of the flagging state to decide what the rules are on that vessel, how much of its sovereignty it wants to like delegate to make laws, as long as it obeys its international treaties. So that a ship can't go taking oil It can't pollute the ocean, and there's kind of clear laws, but it is just operating within existing laws. And with charter cities, it's the newest version of the special economic zone. What it means to be sovereign is that you can delegate lawmaking however you like. What you can't do is like leave your treaty obligations. Um, and so that's why anything that's underneath the country has to follow their treaties and generally their constitution. I guess the Constitution, could say that something doesn't have to follow the Constitution, but we haven't seen or asked for any examples of that. So we are kind of operating within existing systems in order to carve out the freedom to make new ones in a way that's legally solid and stable.
I was aware of the idea of seasteading long before I was aware of you. It was an idea that just caught my imagination from the first time I heard of it, and given that my mind goes in the direction of dreaming up um, systems which would be a radical departure rather than incremental reform. The question that always comes up, as it did in Virgil, is what do you do about existing governments and the power that they inevitably
Yeah.
hold over
We
you.
partner
So
with them. We work with them to what we're looking for is a container within which we can try new systems. And what they're generally looking for is things like jobs, foreign investment, help upskilling their population. So, when I was younger, I sort of was more anti-government, 20 years ago. And now really my job is to work with governments in order to create these kind of experimental containers. So they're my partners now. I mean, look, the people who work in governments, they also struggle by being in a system that doesn't have good incentives and doesn't have good transparency. And, while there's lots of people who are tied to their legacy systems and not interested in changing them, we don't need to convince, my job is not to convince any particular government to do this, but to find a few around the world who see this as the 21st century way of doing things and then work with them.
um, before we move on from seasteading, I do want to ask a few more questions about that,
Yeah,
and then move, more toward the subject of charter cities and alternative governance models. But what is your current perspective on seasteading? I've seen these artist renderings of very elaborate floating communities, which look incredible, but also, bring to mind the question is that possible? Is that practical? Can that be done given weather, given security issues? If you're not under if you're not part of an existing country, well, I recognize that you're sort of a client of existing governments, but I don't imagine that those governments provide for your security in the event that you set up a floating community. So from the vantage point of 20 plus years after you first had this inspiration, do you view seasteading as an important step toward what you're doing now, but something that in all likelihood we will not see those elaborate floating communities in reality? Or do you still believe that those might be part of our future?
sure. I mean, the first thing to know is that uh, when I started out, people would periodically send me these kinds of renderings, but it wouldn't say it was a rendering. It would be like, this is like an architectural concept. And sometimes it would be associated with like a ship manufacturer or design school or something. And it was some years before I realized that these are like basically pure fiction. It's like if you drew a car, the difference between drawing a car and having the full blueprints and specifications for building it, these things sort of masquerade as if somebody has worked through the prices and the material science of like what would happen in the waves and stress. Like that was kind of what I just assumed, but they're actually just concepts. They're like generally like science fiction, maybe motivated somewhat by what's possible, but without any actual examination. Um, so that's one thing. These things are basically all vaporware. They almost never actually get built. I think that there are certain niches for seasteading that make sense to me. Generally one way I think about it is that there's this trade-off where seasteading has, because of the flag registry system, like a shipstead specifically. Now, one of the downsides of seasteading is that anything that's fixed in place, like a floating platform that's anchored to the ocean on pillars, that's actually regulated by the nearest coastal state. This admiralty law system was made specifically for the situation where a given object moves around between different jurisdictions. So for a shipstead, you get this huge advantage of there's competition for who you're going to register with. And if things don't work with the country you're currently registered with, you can find another one. So that's a huge positive thing. And then there's the disadvantage of the ocean being very difficult and expensive. And since you have to be at least 12 miles out, fairly remote. And I don't see those trade-offs as working out in favor of seasteading in very many cases, but I think there are exceptions. People have explored residential cruise ships. There's one that's operating. It lost a lot of money, but it was targeted at a luxury market and it travels all around the world, doesn't go back to the same port for 2 years at a time, which means that the logistics are a total mess and the prices are way higher than something like a Caribbean cruise where these ships are traveling fixed loops. They've set up all of the resupply and made it so that the cost per night is quite low. So I do think that there's a market for residential cruise ships, especially labor intensive. So for example, retirement communities or nursing homes, because they can benefit from labor arbitrage, possibly medical tourism, especially for conditions where you can't easily travel. You could get on a cruise ship, in LA. The ship has to have two different countries on its itinerary, basically, to be under Admiralty law. But it could just cruise back and forth between LA and Mexico, for example, and only do medical procedures when out past 12 nautical miles. So I do think that there's a few of these niches that could work, but I think that right now, kind of like the downsides of being tied to one physical location are more than made up for by kind of the cost effectiveness of building more normally on land and having access to airports and container ports and existing populations and all of these things that are really important. Because if you're building, as you mentioned at the beginning, like uh, kind of all of our wealth comes from divisions of labor and economies of scale and accumulation of capital. And so if you did something that was truly like more of a closed economy, I think it would be incredibly poor and incredibly difficult life. And you can connect seasteads to trade routes and such. It's just everything's more difficult because you've got that extra distance. So that's kind of where I stand right now.
Okay. I don't want to press too much on this because I don't want to put you in a position of having to potentially poo-poo an organization that still exists and is still pursuing this vision. But do I understand correctly that it's your feeling at this point that those artist renderings of of large scale modular floating cities are unlikely to be a reality in the foreseeable future?
I like unlikely. It's not that they're impossible. And I do think that um, well, especially if you could uh, find a way around this like fixed platform thing and have an agreement with the coastal state, for example, that you're autonomous. I do think that there's wave mitigation technology that I designed, like an open ocean breakwater that actually gets economies of scale, where the bigger it is, the cheaper it is. And I do think that there's some potential in the future for someone to do one of these. I just think it's unlikely because of the cost differences, right? I mean, I picked this in the early 2000s as like, well, all the land is taken. Governments in the 2000s were not at all open to this kind of deal. So I was like, well, what's the best bet right now? It's using the ocean and trying to solve the technical challenges and bring the cost down. And it's just that that's no longer true. There's been conversations with, I don't know, probably 20 countries at this point, easily about creating charter city programs, even though there's only one created and law being considered in several other countries. And, now that they're open to it, I just think that this is the more straightforward path.
Yeah, makes sense. All right, so moving to dry land. Can you tell us more about Prospera? First off, what is the vision? What is it about the Zeta that makes it different from just building a development in Honduras?
So the tagline I use these days is cities that write their own laws. And I mean, it's quite different from a normal real estate development, that, level of legal autonomy. And it's even very different from something like a special economic zone. It's actually much more like Hong Kong, a special administrative region where Hong Kong had very different laws from Britain and from China. That's changed to some degree after the handover, but partly I think of like the legal stack, a little bit like a software stack. And I would ask like in this jurisdiction, what percentage of the legal stack is inherited from the country and what is created locally? And a typical special economic zone, it's less than 1% of the law is changed. You can think about it like a little patch onto a code base. And it patches some really important constants, right? Like decreasing tariffs and allowing foreign labor and decreasing taxes. Like it's some stuff that matters, and that's why SEZs have been enormously successful. But it's a tiny percentage of the code base. And a charter city is actually like, no, no, no. Like some substantial portion of the code base we replace and write ourselves. So in Prospera, they have their own commercial law system. And, as I mentioned at the beginning, covers kind of most areas of law that aren't criminal. And one thing that's really neat about commercial law is that it's very sort of voluntarist, contractual. And what I mean is that if somebody commits a crime against someone else, those two have no prior agreement. And so you need to have some way of knowing what the law is that applies there. So that may need to get set at the jurisdiction level. Um, but in a commercial agreement, there's actually no reason that any two people need to be under the same system of law. They just have to agree to it. And in the Prosper system, they actually provide three options, although basically only one of them is used. One is you can incorporate in Prosper and choose the laws of the US or Canada or any of the top 25 OECD countries. I think nobody does this. The second option is you can opt into Prospera's body of regulations. They've kind of looked around the world and tried to copy best practices like mortgage law from Texas and combine them. Again, with the software analogy, it's like all of these different laws in different countries are kind of written to, different like APIs with different system kernels. And if you want to copy them, you have to do some work to reconcile and make them all fit together. But they've done that. That's what I think almost everyone uses. And then the third option, I call it like the punk option, is a sort of a strict liability system where there's no regulations, but you're under common law. And common law includes liability and negligence and remedies for harm and all of this. And if you choose this option, there's no corporate veil. Your directors and officers have to be personally liable for any harm that the business does, and all damages are tripled. So this is sort of a like, you're like, no regulations, fine. Then you have to take responsibility for what happens, to ensure that nobody's being harmed. And, one of the cool things about, even working with their system of regulations is that if you're a company that is incorporating and you're like, look, your current regulations are insufficient. Um, the company can work with Prospera to create a set of regulations for them to use. So, for example, there's multiple medical regimes. I've had some cool medical treatments in Prospera, and I've got another one I'm really excited about this year. And for example, the gene therapy that I had, they worked with Prospera to create an informed consent regime. Whereas there have been other companies that worked to create a sort of a mini FDA, like a lightweight regulator that would actually kind of review and approve things. And again, because associations are voluntary in commercial law, you actually get a polycentric legal system that can innovate where people can kind of like create new regulations just within the contracts that they work or work with Prosper to create it. So that's it from a legal perspective.
What's the what's the governance model? Who's the boss? Who makes the rules? Who and how do those people get chosen?
Yeah, so there's a technical secretary who's a Honduran citizen, um, and then there's the corporation, and there is some sort of checks and balances from the technical secretary, but generally it is corporate governance, meaning that there are shareholders and there's a board of directors, and the board of directors picks the executives, and the legal system is a product. It is governance as a service. It is a business, and their jurisdiction, both the hard assets, the real estate, and the soft assets, the legal system, are all the products of this business.
Who adjudicates, issues like sound ordinances? Let's say somebody's blasting their music in the next apartment, uh, and keeping you from sleeping. Is there a police force? Is there
There's private security, and there's an arbitration center for doing dispute resolution. And you can use a registered international arbitrator who would look at the facts of the case and the the laws and regulations that apply and make a decision.
okay? Um, that doesn't immediately sound like a sufficient solution to the problem of somebody blasting their music at 3 in the morning, because that would take weeks or months to run its course. Is there
I mean, like our system?
Well, in our system, if your neighbors are blasting their music, there is somebody to call. It may work, it may not work, but there's a procedure. Um, and and
Yeah,
and
it mostly hasn't been a problem, it's a small community of people who are living there. Um, but, I guess it would have to be like the person complaining and the person's property would have to be different pieces of property because otherwise you just go to the landlord, and then they would be able to enforce it. But
okay.
that's not really, yeah, that's not, I would say that's not like policing is not the part of the system that we're trying to reinvent. Although I'll note that one of the other Zetas, Ciudad Morazon, which is on the mainland in a very like gritty industrial area, and they focus on low income housing. And one of their like major benefits is safety. And that safety just simply comes from the fact that they have private security who's always stationed there. And, that alone makes it much safer than the region around them. These are houses that are uh, being made for 12K each and then charging 100 a month for rent. So they're just making 10% a year. And that's plenty to hire enough security to keep it safe for the families that live there.
I would imagine when people first hear this idea, if they if they like it, great. But I would imagine a common objection would be, this sounds like Galt's Gulch from Ayn Rand. This sounds like a bunch of well-to-do folks going
Yeah,
and having
Ciudad Morazon is $100 a month rent. to live in $12,000 houses. Um, it's true that some of these communities are focused on like global nomads and tech workers. Uh, I from what I've seen, it's actually quite difficult to get those types of people to move. There's this fallacy I see in the space where people think, oh, I'm making a new community, and so the people who can live anywhere are the ones I'm going to pitch to because they could live here. And they don't notice, well, wait a second, if people can live anywhere, then I'm competing with the entire world for them. They can live in Lisbon or Bali or San Francisco or whatever. And it's actually quite hard to get those people to move. A lot of my work these days is focused on Africa, where we're building for Africans. So I've really, I did kind of get into this at the beginning saying I want to make a community for people like me, but I really don't think that that's product market fit right now, and these ideas are new. I think the best thing to do is to be building for locals. Like the number one reason that people move places is for jobs. Number two reason people move is family reunification. And if you're trying to get people to move to some new or isolated community, you're going against family reunification. Whereas if you're trying to get people to move within the country, or maybe from the region, then they're still close to their families. And the market that I see after locals is the diaspora, people who left the country for economic opportunity and safety, who can come back. And now you're actually going downhill with family reunification. So El Salvador, for example, since Bukele fixed the crime problem, has seen people moving back to El Salvador from the US. They're like, well, there's not crime, and I'd rather live in my homeland. So it's true that kind of that was some of the initial impetus, and a lot of the energy and associations with these projects are, you know, uh, a place to bring a community of people from the developed world. But actually, most of the work is about building for locals right now.
What is the demographic makeup of the population of Prosper? How many people live there? What percent of them um, are from Honduras? What percent of them live there full time?
Yeah, it's quite small. Until about a year ago, there were very few people living there. The main property is a hotel resort, and they only opened the first multifamily residential tower this past spring. I think it's something like 40 or 50 people. There's a higher number of renters and stuff, and hotel guests, but that's long-term residents. I think that few of them are Hondurans, although the majority of people that work there are Honduran, and they're working on developing, more residential housing at a lower cost to appeal to locals. But yeah, I don't know what the exact demographics are.
Um, my understanding
Whereas like
is,
Morazan is basically all locals, and there's a few enthusiastic libertarians who live there, but it's basically all local Hondurans.
yeah, as I mentioned, the $64,000 question is the surrounding government,
Yeah.
and you found a government that was willing to let you do
No, wait,
something.
I didn't find them. That's one of the neat things about Honduras is it was actually a group of people who worked with the government that came to power in 2009 that had Western economics degrees and had heard these ideas, had heard Romer's idea, and decided to just go do it. Whereas in most of the countries we're working with, we're kind of going to them and suggesting the idea. But Honduras 3 years ago, that national conservative government that was in power from 2009 to 2021, obviously I think the Zeta program is great, but they were corrupt. They were in bed with the narco traffickers. In fact, the president who lost the election in 2021, the U.S. had enough evidence to put him in jail, and we're just waiting for him to lose an election because there's a U.S. policy about not arresting sitting presidents of other countries. Um, and people got sick of it. But unfortunately, they elected a Marxist, like a literal Marxist who like stopped recognizing Taiwan and is affiliating with China and restored relations with Venezuela and like a true Marxist. And one of her campaign promises was to shut down this program, to shut down the Zetas. And they haven't been able to in 3 years. even though it was a campaign promise. I think the government sees these projects as their ideological enemy. And, as far as Marxism, I don't know. I think that they're kind of right. But the program was put in the Honduran constitution. It included kind of clauses that any existing zones would be grandfathered in. And so they haven't been able to shut them down. And Prosper is actually suing Honduras for $10 billion. This is just an estimate of what the value of the city would be based on 10 years of growing at the rate that it was growing. And the way that this works, very few people, even in the charter city space, are familiar with this. But again, we're not trying to reinvent the wheel. There's an existing regime of how to enforce agreements on countries. And in fact, there would have to be, otherwise there would be no like cross-border investment, unless it was protected by the US war machine or something. Kind of all investment in the developing world is protected by this system called the New York Convention. And the way that it works is that if a country breaks their agreement, you sue them in one of these investor state dispute resolution systems. You go to international arbitration. It takes like 8 to 10 years, unfortunately. Um, and if you win an award, you then take that award to any other country where the losing country, where say Honduras has property, and those countries will seize any Honduran property and give it to you to satisfy the value of the award. So you're never depending on the country. You're not depending on their courts, their judges, their Supreme Court. You're not depending on them to enforce their agreements or pay you the money because, of course, you can't make a sovereign enforce things on itself. Instead, the check and balance is all of the other countries. And so there's three things you're not allowed to seize. You can't take military assets, obviously. You can't take cultural assets. So like if they're sculptures or exhibited somewhere else, you can't take that. And then diplomatic, you can't take the embassies or the embassy budgets. But any other property you can take. If there's any state-owned enterprises, state-owned businesses, you can take them, you can take their property, you can take their accounts receivable. Like if the state-owned business is selling resources to somebody in any other country, you can just have you can like it's like garnishing wages. Like, okay, we accept your oil, but we pay this other person because you owe them money. So that's the system. And of course, charter cities are very new and very small. We couldn't create such a system, we couldn't invent it. We're nobody on the world stage. But the entire world benefits from people being able to invest and start businesses in other countries. And so there's a system that the whole world runs on, and we're just using it.
I can't be the first person who made the comparison to Galt's Gulch. You must hear that a lot, right?
I have an I am John Galt t-shirt,
Okay.
but Galt's Gulch was kind of it's ignoring the poverty of self-sufficiency. It's about dropping out and separating. Um, and I view charter cities as being part of the international networks of trade, right? Like any other city, we don't want to have to do everything ourselves. But there is some similarity in the sense of, people in Atlas Shrugged who felt like the system was not working for them and they wanted to live a different way, went out and created it. Like that part's similar.
Do you not think that it's a public relations problem, that the host government is now hostile to the community and that there is now a lawsuit for $10 billion pending against a poor country?
So note that Honduras is getting sued by more companies than any other country in the world under this president, President Castro. So it's not like it's just us, country breaks their agreements, they get sued. This is the international way. Like the alternative is like, I don't know. So here's my favorite part about it, which is, with a Marxist president, they're cozying up to China. And China, as they do, Belt and Road style, their soft power, China is ready to invest hundreds of millions of dollars into building things in Honduras. And Honduras has withdrawn from the main investor state dispute resolution network, which is called ICSID. They believe that this network kind of systematically favors the corporations over the countries. And so they withdrew. Now, this doesn't get them out of the 10 existing lawsuits, but for the future. And China said to Honduras, hey guys, we can't invest these hundreds of millions of dollars in your country unless you're in an investor state dispute resolution network. They said it doesn't have to be ICSID, the main one. There's a few like smaller upstart competitors. You can choose a different one. But like even China, like even their new commie friends, like it's so basic to all like internet, like all cross-border investment in the world that even China was like, you got to do this. Like you have to be in a network, otherwise you don't get the money.
Um, it would seem to me that I may
I don't
have
know.
said
Is it bad PR? I don't know. I mean, it's been a stress test of these defense mechanisms. And so far, they've held up quite well. Not perfectly. Honduras is charging some sales taxes and stuff that we think they probably don't have the right to charge. But basically, Prosper's been able to just keep operating. And so, it's really unfortunate that they elected a president who's not willing to follow her own constitution. Um, Her husband, actually, before 2009, her husband was the president and he tried to abolish term limits, which was unconstitutional. And like Congress passed something abolishing term limits so he could, stay president. And the Supreme Court said this is against our Constitution. And the military had to pick sides. The military kicked him out, and that led to the elections that brought this 2009 government in. So like, yeah, they don't believe in following their own Constitution. I don't think this is our fault, but it does create some attack surface. So, for example, Senator Elizabeth Warren, I don't know, a year or two ago, her and 20 Democratic Congresspeople signed a letter urging the Biden administration to like do whatever the minimum amount of enforcement of US investor treaties is, like under our treaty obligations, like specifically about this lawsuit. They're like, oh, this private company is suing this poor country. And, it's just pure signaling because the entire international, like all cross-border investment depends on this system. Um, so kind of everybody's screwed if places with more money can't use it, like send the money to places with less money to like build stuff so that they can get richer. Like we all lose. So it's pure signaling, but it's true that there's an attack surface.
it seems to me inevitable that a situation like this is is going to arise at some point because you start the thing under a given governmental regime. um, the more and more successful it becomes, the juicier and juicier of a fruit it represents to competing power blocks in the host country. Um, and it seems to me like it's just a matter of time before it becomes so juicy that somebody is not going to try to pick it.
I
You
mean,
may
we'll
be
find
right.
out, but I mean, you could say the same thing about like resource extraction, right? Like when somebody builds a titanium mine or, an oil refinery, but like those things cost hundreds of millions and sometimes billions of dollars to build. And the only reason that private companies do it is that they can make more than that by extracting the resource and use these international mechanisms to ensure that the country that they made an agreement with doesn't just change their mind. I mean, I'm not saying this is trivial, um, but and also, when people ask me about this, I kind of liken it to the question of like, if you have a successful product, how do you keep it from being outcompeted? And there's not like one answer to this, right? There's a whole set of things you want to do. And I think the main thing that keeps these projects safe is how much value they're producing for the locals, how many people they're employing. Like that's your primary safety. And Prosper's employed like a moderate number of people, but not yet a number high enough to impact the Honduran economy. But for example, a company we work with in Africa called Rendeavor, it's kind of the main private city developer there, and they're running, I don't know, several thousand, maybe 10,000 hectares of coffee in Kenya in their Tatu City project. And like the local municipality started trying to like extract money from them corruptly, and they're employing like 10,000 plus people. And so the city operator just published like the details of how he was trying to like shut them down if they didn't pay him bribes. And then he was just like inundated with like angry people who are like, what are you doing? Like, this is the major employer in this entire area. So I think that providing value for the citizens is the first line of defense. Um, and it's and like an economy that depends on a different regulatory environment, like that's not something that you can just take. Like you can just take resources in theory, but if you have an economy because of a different regulatory environment, like if you change the regulatory environment, that economy goes away. Like it gets juicy, but that doesn't exist if you take it and change it. I mean, look at all the wealth that's fleeing Hong Kong. I mean, you can take the stuff that's already built there, maybe, but you kind of you kill the goose that lays the golden eggs, and even just taking the stuff is not easy, you know, as with this international regime.
What's been the effect of the change of government on people buying into Prospera?
It's had a chilling effect on people moving there and businesses opening there and on raising money. I mean, they did an incredible job. They raised $100 million over like a 2 to 3 year period, like during this period with the hostile regime, which was, absolutely amazing. But it's been much harder. It's not hard to get people to visit, but it's a big deal if you're like, I'm going to move there and I'm going to open a business that depends on the regulatory environment, and you're worried that that regulatory environment might change. It's much harder.
What's the what's the investment model? You describe Pronomos as a venture capital firm, so you're presumably taking in capital from investors and deploying it in
Hmm.
Prospera and other future projects. I understand that I've heard you say in other videos that you think Africa is really where it's at for this kind of thing. Um, what is what is the investment model for Prospera? What is the investment model for whatever projects you're currently working on in Africa?
Yeah, so, these are generally like private for-profit C corporations. Sometimes there are multiple different entities. A common thing in real estate is the division between what's called the operating company or OpCo and the property company or PropCo. So imagine like the hotel resort at Prospera and like the land around it versus like Prosper itself. So the risk return profiles of owning real estate and owning a company that's managing the real estate and collecting the taxes and doing additional real estate developments are quite different. Real estate generally has like lower returns, but there's less risk because worst case, you still have this property. Whereas one can invest in a startup and have it be worth nothing. And so, Prospera has this OpCo PropCo model. Some companies don't. Some have it all in one company. But and when there is a division, we tend to invest in the operating company. We kind of want to be at like the highest level of risk return, and in the entity that, for example, if Prospera um, opens developments in other countries. And they've hired like a Magat Wade to be head of Prosper Africa last year. She's an amazing entrepreneur. The operating company is like the top level company. It will also have, it will also manage those things in other countries. So, the property company, yeah, it's got like less downside risk. Um, but it doesn't have as much growth potential. And so we invest in those operating companies. And then, the business model, of course, different projects focus differently, but I like to think of it as just a combination of a real estate developer and a government. So how does a real estate developer make money? They make money from rents and from land appreciation. Land in a city is worth much, much more than rural land because it's valuable because there's other stuff around it. And so you have both of those. And then a government provides government services, collects taxes and fees. And so a charter city just combines those two things. It benefits from land appreciation, it collects rents, and collects taxes and fees.
What obviously you're not going to tell me who your investors are, but could you describe their
Oh,
profile?
lots of them are public. Um, Peter Thiel's our largest investor. We have investors like Mark Andreessen, Balaji Srinivasan, Joe Lonsdale. Um, but I would say that aside from Peter, the majority of our investors are from the crypto world. And, crypto has been a huge tailwind for my work. And I think the reason is that, like, what is crypto? It's trying to create decentralized, experimental, private alternatives to money and finance, which have traditionally been handled by the nation state and huge banks. And we're trying to create decentralized, experimental, private alternatives to most of what government does, to being lawmakers, to an entire government. And so it's very, very much the same vision and the same vibe. It's just that they operate in a much narrower scope, which is why they're making faster progress, because it's much easier to replace one function of government than many of them. But because of that, there's a really strong alignment. Like, crypto people get it, and lots of crypto people have gotten rich over the past 15 years. So, aside from Peter, not everyone, but a majority of the investors are from the crypto world.
Would you say that that your typical investor is more driven by risk reward, evaluating this thing as an investment, or someone who buys into the vision of competing governance
Yeah.
model of starting an entrepreneurial market for such things?
My investors are very highly mission oriented. I think it wouldn't really make sense to invest in something so new and experimental as this otherwise. That said, in order to succeed at the mission, like, you asked what Prosper's vision of is, like, they want to make a Hong Kong for the Western Hemisphere. I want to build cities that eventually have hundreds of thousands and millions of people in them. And to do that is going to take, like, literally, like, hundreds of billions of dollars of capital. And the way to get hundreds of billions of dollars of capital is to, like, make money on tens of millions so that you can get hundreds of millions and make money on it, and scale your way up by providing a positive return along the way. So to succeed at the mission, we have to be profitable. But somebody who is just looking for profit, like, this sector is way too new and experimental for it to make sense for somebody who is purely profit focused to come in.
So Peter Thiel and Mark Andreessen and the like are involved with you because they agree and want to
They want to
support.
support this mission of letting people experiment with new types of societies.
Okay. Um, I'm so tempted to go into the crypto direction, but I feel like if we do that, we're going to end up spending the whole rest of the time talking about that because, as you know, and a number of the folks who are joining us know, I have strong views about monetary systems. I'm kind of wanting to shy away from that because there's so many other things that I want to talk to you about, and I want to have time for them. But
Maybe we can just say, like, crypto, like, it is an exciting laboratory where people are getting to experiment with all kinds of different monetary and governance systems with large amounts of real money at stake. And, I'm sure we each have our areas of how those systems are currently being designed that we are deeply skeptical of. But I think, in the same way as with charter cities, it's like you don't have to agree with me in any way about how a better society could be designed for us to agree, hey, we need to let people do these experiments, on an opt-in basis. And, I would maybe a way to kind of like set aside the crypto issue is to say like, hey, you know, do you agree, Josh, that like people are doing a bunch of stupid stuff, but isn't it cool that at least they're getting to like experiment with all kinds of different monetary systems and building the tech to do it?
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. I'm not
Yeah,
anti-crypto. Um, I don't like Bitcoin. I think Bitcoin is got it exactly wrong. Um, but
right.
I think that crypto has an enormous amount of potential. I wouldn't call myself uh, an advocate, but I am very open to the idea that it's a space worth paying attention to, worth thinking about, worth working with. I've had a number of people from the crypto space get in touch with me in response to this series, in response to the Gazelle course, which led to this series. And there are a number of people who are interested in using Gazelle's ideas in the crypto space. So I am
I mean, outside of Bitcoin, like one of the default or one of the sort of like the common systems is a demurrage system where tokens are being created and then used to fund public goods, for example. So it's actually like quite common
is
in
that
crypto.
is that
Oh, many of them. It like outside Bitcoin, many of the token networks have like a steady increase in the money supply, and they mint new tokens, and then they use that to fund development of the network, and that's kind of built in a bunch of them.
okay? I'm going to follow up with you offline about that
Sure,
because I definitely want to know names of tokens that I may not know about, which are using demurrage.
sounds good.
Um, One thing that I heard you say, and I watched a bunch of your videos and talks and YouTube interviews in preparation for this, and something that you said that really resonated with me was you said a mental health tip is to never try to convince anyone of anything. Um, and I resonate with that idea. I've often described myself in the realm of spirituality as a devout agnostic, which is to say that I think it is uh, extremely arrogant for any human being to imagine that they are capable of coming to any conclusive view of the nature of the universe. I think that to imagine that our brains are capable of that is absurd in this in the scale and scope of the universe. So agnosticism is something that I believe in deeply. Um, and it makes sense to me that agnosticism, that not having an agenda to convince anyone of anything would be the right mindset for someone in your position. Um, because again, correct me if I'm misunderstanding what you do, but um, I would say that for the most part, you are facilitating other people's visions rather than promoting your own specific vision. Is that correct?
Yeah, this is actually someplace where I'm very much against the Ayn Rand worldview. Is like I hold the value of diversity of different people trying different things and getting to live in different ways. I hold that much more tightly than I hold my libertarianism. And to me, like there's a flavor of libertarianism and Marxism and lots of other isms that says this is true, right, and wrong. If you disagree, you're bad. And my job is to convince lots of other people that this is the objective morality and the objective right and wrong. And like, I mean, that's toxic. Like that's the way that people in toxic relationships treat each other is like, let me hammer into your head, let me tell you what to think. Let me tell you what to believe. Let me tell you what's right and wrong and hammer it into your head. I think it's deeply toxic on a personal level and on a political level. And so I think there's things I like about Ayn Rand's like glorification of the creator and, more makers, less takers. That stuff is great. But this idea that there is some objective political philosophy that you can reason by looking at the universe is like just complete nonsense. And the people who I call it like universalism, the people who believe that everyone should think what they think, that everybody should see right and wrong, good and bad as they do, like that's my enemy, much more than like states are my enemy or coercion is my enemy. So yeah, I really profoundly believe that we should get to try different things, and that if you're trying to hammer something into someone's head, then it's probably bad for both of you.
Well, I couldn't agree more about that. Um, However, I wanted to re-examine that quip. Uh, a mental health tip is to not try to convince anyone of anything, from a different angle.
Hmm.
Um, as I mentioned, the reason why I'm doing this is because I have spent a long time thinking about and then later advocating for a specific economic perspective and a certain set of specific economic proposals. Sorry, got a cat messing with me. And I have at a life level, I agree with that trying to convince people of things is a recipe for frustration and certainly I agree in many cases for toxicity. Um, but what do you say to your founders, your clients, the people who are coming to you with innovative governance, but specific governance and economic models that they have spent their lives dreaming up? Um, Presumably, they think quite differently about the importance of convincing other people of things.
Yeah, I think about the difference between arguing and debating. Like I can have a conversation with someone where we hold different views and we're kind of like co-exploring that, and we're each trying to understand the other person's view and help them understand ours and find where the areas of difference are and zoom in and see if we can explore them. And that's great. That's not what I mean. What I mean is like any situation in which there's defensiveness. There's that sort of like I'm trying to get you to think something and you're resisting and pushing back and not like actually listening. That's what I think is harmful. And so, it's not about not spreading your ideas. It's about spreading your ideas to people who are curious and open-minded and, you know, not trying to spread them to people who aren't, because it almost never works. And it's, however tempting it is, because we're so excited that like, no, this is the way, if only you would listen. But if they're not listening, then it's just a waste of time for both of you.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that there's a personality type. Well, I'll ask you, do you think that there is a personality type that tends to choose these walks of life? people who are trying to dream up new, untested, visionary systems. My experience, my limited experience with those kinds of people is that they they tend to be my way or the highway kinds of people. They're so invested in their vision that that they're not very capable of listening to other ideas and really taking them in.
Yeah.
Would you agree that that is a valid generalization of the kinds of people who are working on these kinds of projects?
I I don't know that I think it's the majority of people, but I do think that it is like a really common subtype. It's, in relationships we call it like one-itis, when like you're just obsessed with one person as opposed to like trying to find a good fit. Um, so I do think it's common, but I think that there is like another neurotype, which is just like the systems thinker who like likes to apply a bunch of different models to every situation. Like me, like I love collecting new models. Like I get excited when I come across some new way of viewing the world that adds something to my previous ways, even if I disagree with a bunch of it. And I think there's a bunch of situations that don't apply. Every time I find some new mental model that's really different from my other ones, like my view of the world gets clearer. And I think that there are a lot of people who are like that, who are like, hey, I see a whole bunch of different systems and their trade-offs, and here's my informed thought about some ways that we might be able to do better than any of the current ones, as opposed to the people who are like, no, there's this one true way. Like I think there's a lot of both. And the people who are like, there's one true way, I feel like they rarely accomplish. I mean, they do like, they are able to bring people together because they have this strong, direct vision that's great for coordination. At the same time, they tend to be really poor at pragmatically adjusting to everything that's necessary to bring the world from here to their vision and finding all the compromises and along the way and learning and revising along the way. They tend to be pretty poor at all of that. And so I feel like projects led by those kinds of people tend to really like flame out over time when the rubber meets the road.
Yeah, well, that makes sense. I guess I'd like to ask you your advice. This is a brand new series. The purpose of this series is to bring those kinds of people into dialogue with each other. Um, have you
Hmm.
have you tried that yourself? Have you tried to facilitate networking, to facilitate exchange of ideas between the different groups and or individuals that you are aware of that have, their specific ideas
Not
for.
really, because the thing, like, I'm focused on enabling people to put their ideas into practice, and like, there's still like years of work to do on that. And so, I feel like that, in a sense, if they can't put their ideas into practice, then kind of like who cares? What's the point of even communicating and dialoguing if you're never going to build it? And like if you can put your ideas into practice, then instead of like debating about theories, like we can actually go and visit the different places and see how they're working and actually get that feedback of reality, which is like the true arbiter of success of ideas. Um, and then I think, if a bunch of different visions have been put into practice, then I think we can have an incredible conversation about what works and what doesn't. But I'm focused on that fundamental enabling.
Okay, I get that. I'm not sure I agree with it because I think that there's a very selective filtering process that will take a lot of people out of the conversation who just don't have the wherewithal or the skills to bring their ideas to fruition, but who might have valuable contributions to
Hmm.
make. Um,
I think we are so idea rich and experiment poor. I feel like it's not that I don't think that theorizing and people coming up with different approaches is a good thing. It's like that's because we haven't been able to put things into practice very many times in the world. I think we have like a backlog of a ton of different proposed systems and a ton of different ideas and philosophies. And like, we don't need any more. We have like literally 10, at least maybe 100 times as many as we need. Like, if we could put 10 of them into practice, like that would be way more powerful than having like 47,000 instead of 23,000 like ideas to rework society.
Okay, well, that is actually provides me with a convenient segue to something else that I heard you speak about that I'd like to hear you speak about more, which is the idea of systems of government being like open source software. Um, the the vision, my vision, the one that made me, want to do all of this stuff, um, contains a governance piece. Because if you're going to try to bring human beings into relationship and interaction with each other, then of course the question is, how do you adjudicate all of the different, disputes, disagreements that are inevitably going to arise. Um, and being a devout agnostic, I don't presume that I know what the best answer to that question is. I don't think there is a best answer to that question. I think that it oftentimes depends greatly on the specific circumstances. Um, and so as I'm trying to dream up this package, which would contain a governance toolkit, that governance toolkit would consist of um, an open source library, essentially, of governance models, um, so that a new community that is looking at this toolkit with the idea of putting it on its feet, buying a piece of land, putting these ideas into practice, can choose any of a pre-existing menu of governance models, or they can go into the code and make some tweaks to the existing menu items, or they can design something from scratch. Um, I think you're right that there's been no real progress in governance models um, in forever, um, and that's a problem. Um, so, could you talk more um, about the menu of options that you see people working with? For example, I heard you mention something called liquid democracy, which sounded fascinating to me. Um, could you talk about liquid democracy? Could you talk about other kind of standout innovations in the realm of governance models that you've become aware of?
Yeah, I can talk a little bit, although I will say, like, I used to be like a mechanism geek, right? I was into those kinds of questions, and I've just shifted my focus like more and more to this meta level of like, let me not even worry about the different mechanisms. Let me just try to make a world where people can implement them. But I can't talk little. One thing I'll say is that I think what people like anybody who hears like open source law and has like any surprise isn't realizing that like 99.9% of law is open source. meaning it's openly published and available and anyone can copy it. Uh, like, unless it's a secret policy, like a secret hidden policy, which there are some of, even in this country, but not very many, all law is inherently open source. Um, actually, the Prospera option of letting people use US law if they want to is an example. US law is published, so you can just choose it, and we can have your arbitrator judge your cases by US law. Uh, One of our portfolio companies, Metropolis, has been working with several South Pacific countries to create an offshore corporate registry where you could incorporate, like, using the laws of Delaware or Singapore or the Caymans, because there's actually absolutely nothing stopping you from just saying, we're going to interpret all corporate law with the laws of Delaware and the precedents of Delaware as they update. So law actually kind of is open source, and we're just not aware of that and we're not using it. Like an example, and I'm sorry this isn't, exactly what you were saying, but or what you were asking, but like in the UAE, they let people from Europe use the family law of their home country instead of being under like the Sharia-based law in the Emirates, because family law only applies to this closed group of people. It governs like marriage and divorce and who gets the kids and who gets the money within this closed group of people. So there's actually no reason that a German family that moves to Dubai like needs to be under Emirates family law. And so, they just said like, okay, you can just be under German family law if you move here. So again, it's taking advantage of the fact that like law is open source. Liquid democracy is the idea of having uh, like proxiable and issue specific voting. So the idea is that instead of voting once every 2 or 4 years in some election for representative, you delegate your vote to a person, and anybody who collects more than a certain number of votes gets a seat in the House, for example, like in the House of Representatives. And you can delegate your vote to someone, and they can delegate all of their votes to someone else. So I would just pick somebody who I trust. So rather than everybody having to learn about every political candidate, you decide who you trust and give them your vote. And then a smaller number of people actually put in the time and the research to decide who to delegate their vote to. And then an even smaller number of people then go out and are professional lawmakers and wield those votes. And then the other important thing about liquid democracy is that, rather than having to like pick one, like this idea of like representatives by geographic regions is like very antiquated, right? So in liquid democracy, you can proxy your votes for different issues. So you might proxy your vote on the environment to someone different than on the economy. And of course there's complicated corner cases in a given case, like which area does this fall under? But in general, the idea is that you can switch your vote whenever you want. You can give your vote to different people on different topics, and we can have a much more dynamic system where as things happen, people are constantly shifting their votes around, as opposed to this, one way like I think about the current system is like the number of bits of information that I get to transmit to the government. It's like every 2 years, I fill out a form with like 30 or 40 questions, so it's like less than 100 bits every 2 years is what I get to give. Like this is totally absurd. Um, so liquid democracy is potentially a way to address some of this. But what I would recommend is that people who are interested in democratic systems and governance mechanism design is that we have this Nobel Prize winning school of economics called public choice, which is just game theory and mechanism design applied to things like democracy. It just follows the logic of the incentives, and it's actually like quite depressing, I think. And like I'm I'm I've been shocked at how few people know it and how few people apply it, even among economists. And it's somewhat scathing on democracy And the basic issue, which liquid democracy helps some with, is this idea of um, what's called concentrated versus dispersed interest. So just imagine that there's a law or a paragraph in a law in the US, which is up for vote, and it's going to cost every American $1. So that's minus $350 million of value. And it's going to benefit one company or industry by 50 million. So that law is like it costs 350, it makes 50. That's a net $300 million loss for the country. But if if you were to like go out and learn about this law and single-handedly defeat it in 1 hour of work, you just made $1 because that law only cost you $1. And this logic, I think, is actually ubiquitous in democracy. Democracy constantly passes laws that hurt everybody and benefit a few special interests just because of this logic. If you're the company that benefits by 50 million or the 10 companies in an industry, you're going to know about this paragraph. You probably wrote it. You know who to support. You're going to put your time into it. Whereas all the people who it costs, it only costs you by $1. And like, yeah, I guess in theory, my congressman or senator is like supposed to somehow represent me, but like, how am I ever going to know if they like screwed me out of $1 here and $1 here and $1 there? And so when you only have a tiny bit of interest in something, it just doesn't pay you to like learn about it and pay attention in it. And so like actually like I think people have this intuition like, oh, the special interest won again. If only we elected the right person, if only we made like stronger laws against corruption. But like, no, actually, from an economist perspective, democracies should constantly reward special interests at the expense of everyone. It's just like this, the like straightforward game theory of the situation. So I would definitely recommend, anybody who's interested in governance systems to go and like learn some of the basics of public choice theory. Because it's really like scathing and ubiquitous. And I actually find like an astonishingly small percentage of like proposed activism and government reform like takes it into account.
I want to stay with this subject, but first I just want to briefly mention to the audience, I see a bunch of people typing in the chat. Like I mentioned, I am not able to monitor the chat while this is going on. So if any of you folks want to participate in the conversation, raise your hand. Hit the raise hand button under the React tab. Okay, yeah, we got a couple
Let's
of
do
raised
it.
hands. Let's start with Mr. Marty Rowland. Marty, welcome.
No, welcome. I'm enjoying the conversation. Don't have a whole lot to say about Prospera since it's off and running, and I think the lessons are being learned, in real time. What my interest is on the so-called floating cities. I think it's being a licensed engineer. I think it's more stable and probably a better design to have the cities like maybe 50 feet below the surface of the ocean. I think you'll find that it's going to be a lot more, not subject to waves and other kind of disasters. Is anybody thinking along those lines, or are they really bought into the idea of floating with the atmosphere overhead? Seems kind of arbitrary.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think it's the people are bought into it. It's just that there are really significant engineering challenges to being under the water as well. There is like an underwater like Airbnb, I think, in the Florida Keys that you have to dive down to. People have done a few of these. One thing to remember is that if you're out in the deep ocean, I think that wave motion falls off with like the square root of the wavelength, I think, in depth. And in the deep ocean, those wavelengths can be like tens of meters long. I don't know how if you're familiar, but like, and Marty, you probably know this, but like for the readers, like we see waves, but if you look at individual water particles, like each of those individual water particles are going in circles, and even like below, like it's not like you have your wave and like 1 inch below the wave, there's like no motion. It's actually like all those water particles below the wave are also making circles, just smaller circles. So there is some like significant wave, um, within like I said, it's the square root of the wavelength, I think. Um, so you do have to have some significant depth, but I think that the engineering challenges are significant because you're moving people and goods in and out, and unless you've got like a moon pool dock, then you're having to deal with diving. But I don't think it's prejudice. I mean, we've talked about undersea steading. We've talked about air steading. There's people working on blimps and stuff. Like, it's definitely a community where people explore all kinds of ideas. I think it's just pretty difficult, but people have built small ones.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
All right, thanks, Marty. Peter Frank, do you want to turn on your camera and join us? Let me
Hey,
screen.
yes. Um, how do how do you deal with things like unemployment or homelessness?
Yeah, these are things that we're mostly not trying to innovate on. Um, these like a city like Prospera, um, if you can't afford your rent, then you leave. It's not, we're not trying to solve like national level welfare problems, but like everything else in a city, it's up to the city creator to come up with what their system is. And so, other people are welcome to have UBI or unemployment benefits or whatever they want.
Um, okay, so when you say other people, you mean other potential cities,
Yeah, other city creators.
right? Okay, yeah,
But the cities that I'm investing in, these are like for-profit products where the city is the product and the people who live there are their customers. And we're looking to provide services to customers and not to do charity. Charity is like a
right,
different sector.
right. That's the difference between a state and an office building, you know, like an office building doesn't have a responsibility to the population in its geographical area, whereas a state does. So that's kind of, for me, that's a big deal. But like you said, it's up to people creating these places to figure that out. But I mean, this, forgive me for being cynical, but um, it seems like an office building more than a sovereign state.
Well, it's not sovereign right now. My long-term goal is to create sovereign states, but these are like enabled by national legislation or changes in the country's constitution
Mhm.
and operating, within another state. But as I said with the commercial law and Prospera, the areas of law that we get to write are very broad. Medical regulation, financial regulation, contracts, like currencies, labor law. It's quite a lot. Uh, and it I I I think I view these as like opt-in societies. And so, if I privately own and develop an area and I have an opt-in society with certain rules, I would say it's my choice who to take. Um, and when you come in, you agree to live under those rules and people are welcome to create opt-in societies for all kinds of different purposes with different protections. I'm personally like see much more potential and much more interested in helping the global south to upscale and get rich and like replicating the Singapore miracle and like creating jobs and a path to wealth for people in Africa, for example, as opposed to like we are directly addressing unemployment by bringing in industries and investments and creating jobs. That's how I want to help, not by, I don't know, giving benefits.
It seems like you're talking more like an employer than, I don't know, a government or, you know, an administrator of a geographical area. Um, But I mean, we could go on back and forth, for a long time.
Yeah, that's my model, but like I said, I hold my model much more lightly than I hold the general idea that people should be able to take new systems and put them into practice with those who want to try them. Like that's what I hold tightly.
Right. The anarchist kind of view of a sovereign area that isn't beholden to capitalism, making a profit. There was a guy in Italy who built his own. You must know.
Yes. Isle of Roses, yeah.
Yeah. So that what you're describing isn't that. You know.
No, he had no legal permission to do what he did, whereas our
Right.
projects are created under national legislation.
Right. Right. Okay. Thanks.
Yeah, no problem.
Before we go to the next question, I'd like to follow up on that last subject. I have great admiration for your vision and your boldness in actually making such visionary ideas practical reality on the ground. To accomplish that is monumental. But what I don't yet get is, and maybe you don't have an answer for it, is how does this approach go from where it's currently at of building prosperous and other communities, like it, to truly representing an alternative to national governments?
Yeah, it's a question of scale, right? Like when, if and when these communities are as large as small countries, then they'll start to more and more act and be treated as them. And, we have some specific ideas about what the most viable legal routes are to get recognized as a country. It's really important that the projects that will try to become sovereign nations, that needs to be very clear from the beginning in terms of whatever land they're operating on, whatever country they're working with. For like a charter city to then try to like secede or something, that would be like us breaking our agreements and like being like the guest who like you invited to stay at your house and then like tried to claim that your house was yours. So even though long term I want to start sovereign nations, it's very, very important that charter cities continue to operate properly within the systems and expectations that they came into. But I think that there's a lot of, in this space, I see people kind of suggesting these like different like legal hacks, like, oh, what if we take some land that this country said that they don't recognize, or that this like these two countries next to it said is not our land, and like that's not how international law works. It's not that you have some like hack or like sea land, which was outside the territorial waters at the time and like was somewhat independent, but you can't like take a letter where like someone in one country says like, yeah, that's not our land. That doesn't mean that by like taking that land you're a country. Like a country is defined by other countries that recognize them. And so I think that the proper process is not you have some kind of hack that gets someone to recognize you and then you make a country. It's that you make a self-governing city or area that's larger than a bunch of small countries and effectively is economically and politically and diplomatically like of country scale. And then you work towards getting other countries to recognize it.
I'm going to ask you a really silly question, but humor me. If you had to put a number to it, what year do you think we will see the first sovereign nation grow out of?
2035.
Okay.
Maybe I should say 2036. I was just rounding. I've been working on this for 23 years, and I feel like we're about 2/3 of the way there.
Okay. I didn't expect that precise an answer, but thank you. All right, Michael Linton had his hand raised. Let me
Thank you very much. This is great. Really nice to hear the cogence of your approach to this. It's sort of like playing cards. I believe you did. You do. Eh? Which brings me to the issue of moral hazard. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
In a card game, there's no moral hazard. They're playing for the odds. But we have a conventional economy where there's an antagonism between the buyer and the seller, and there's a lot of room in the persuasion. And so there's often a lot of extraction and damage done by a money which is contentious and disabling. Now, the other point is basically, I'm looking at the way you're testing your ideas in real world. Very ballsy, but it takes people with big money to play that game and the ability to carry that risk. I'm surprised you're not more active in modeling. You're digital, you understand these places. Surely models are easier, cheaper, faster, more flexible.
We have so many models and so many ideas. We have no deficit of those. What we have is a deficit of things put into real world practice.
Yeah.
And so that's my focus, not because I don't think that models are important, but because, at some point, just models and philosophizing and debating and white papers just kind of becomes intellectual masturbation because we've already got a good set of things to try. And now we've got twice as many things as we could try. Now we've got 10 times as many things as we could try. So I think all of that is important, but I think like the time for action is now. Like we live in a world where you can actually build this stuff. And I do think, I have my criticisms of crypto, but the plus side is like people are actually building shit and putting into practice all kinds of different like monetary systems and ways of incentivizing different stakeholders, and they're like actually doing it. I feel like 10 years ago, the ratio of like theories to practice was like way, way worse.
Well, that line was following the logic of the incentive in the game theory.
Yeah, show me the incentives and I'll show you the outcome, I think is Charlie Munger.
Yeah, exactly. What do we do to change the incentives?
Yeah, so the explanation I gave of that standard public choice theory about, when the costs are just distributed thinly among many people, it benefits. If I'm a city and I make a legal change that costs everybody $1, that actually comes back to me in terms of rents and taxes and stuff. It actually costs me a significant amount. So there is an argument that like a private city operator or a private governance operator, like if I can pass a law like that, and this gets into like law and economics, which is, a field that my family's been into, but and like the economic theory underlying anarcho-capitalism, but a private city operator should actually be looking for the opposite. If I can do something that benefits a million people in my city by $10, but it costs somebody else $1 million, then I should like charge my million people like $3 extra for getting this $10 benefit, and they'll be happy. And then of that $3 million, I pay 1.5 to the person who it costs $1 million, and now they've made 500,000 and I've kept a profit. And if you trace through the incentives, it actually gets fixed to some degree. Now, I'm not saying there aren't other issues with private governance. I know some people aren't comfortable with it, but that's an example of how under a different system, the incentives can change.
And the patterning the incentives, making the incentives feed back into the model rather than feed out from it. Now, a last question, if I may, was Civitas. Jordan Hall, I can never remember what he's talking about the power of a cluster of cultures to generate more wealth than they could independently, and therefore this convergent process. Any thoughts on that in relation to your work?
I mean, I'm a big fan. I think that he's one of the great system thinkers in the world today. And we're kind of like focused on different parts of the problem, I would say, but I'm definitely a big fan of his work.
So you believe in cities, eh? Cities is good.
I do.
Right. Thank you very much. This has been delightful. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, we've got less than 10 minutes left. We try to keep these sessions to 2 hours. And we did not really get into the money subject because
We're just going
I'm
to
here.
joke about it. All right, we got 8 minutes to settle whether interest is positive or negative or zero.
Well, I'm here to interview you. You're not here to interview me, so that's why I didn't want to intrude
No, it's
by
great.
I had the
talk-
same conversation with your grandfather, incidentally.
Well,
Mhm.
that's what I wanted to actually use this last few minutes to ask you about. I know that your grandfather passed in 2006, I believe. What do you think he would have made of crypto?
Well, I mean, I think to a first blush, I think he would have liked it. I mean, there's that great
Yeah, he
video
would.
segment of him saying that the internet needs a native uh, way to transact. And I think that he would have loved the experimentation, but I'm sure that he would have had a number of technical opinions, as you and I do, about the specifics of inflationary and deflationary currencies and the governance mechanisms of DAOs and all these kinds of things. I don't think he would have been excited about Bored Apes NFTs, but I think he would have been excited to see the experiment of a fixed monetary supply happen, and probably would have had some opinions about how that would work out.
I feel quite confident that he would not have liked the fixed supply model.
No, I don't think so. I mean, he proposed, increasing the money supply, proportional to GDP growth. So,
And he looked for the most efficient instrument in doing that. So when he and I had conversations about money some 40 years ago, and his theory was the best one won, the strongest one. And so he couldn't understand why anybody would have any possibility of addressing anything but the US dollar. And my point was that we were looking for money that did different things, not money that did the same shit better. Thank you.
yeah, I think I can't get into this in 5 minutes, but I do have a bunch of opinions about what money should be in the 21st century.
Yes.
Not anything that it's been before.
Well, I would like to hereby invite you back for session number 2 to talk about that
Sure, that'd
specifically.
be great fun. I have some notes.
But in the last 5 minutes that we have, could you do any of your existing portfolio of projects include alternative monetary systems, or do they all intend to operate under existing currency regimes?
I mean, Prosper has recognized Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies as legal tender. I have sort of mixed feelings on this, where I feel like from a technical risk perspective, like a successful startup tries to do at most one new hard thing, and having to succeed at multiple new hard things is a recipe for failure. In gambling terms, it's a parlay. You have to like win each bet in order to win. And so I've generally been pretty skeptical, even though people always ask about this. But there is like another standpoint where it's like, well, if you're making a new place, then you're not locked into a bunch of old systems, and you should probably be adopting a bunch of new technologies. I would say like probably like the newest proven technologies is like the right risk reward point. Um, our project in West Africa, we're working with a number of countries, and one of the things that we want to create is a financial center that is like the Silicon Valley reinvention of the financial center, in the same way that startups have rewritten a bunch of industries. Is like, what if you created a financial center that was all based on code, all as an API with smart contracts, and AI regulators, and just, made it a really easy platform to spin up banks and fintech companies, etc. And doing this, we would likely like have a native token, I think fits into it. And, we've explored like doing tokens for the different countries that we're working in, doing a token across all of them, creating like stable coins within a country. So it is something that we're exploring, but I do kind of prefer to like decompose. Like I really think that government needs to be decomposed more. It's a bundle of a whole bunch of different things, and you buy all of them at once and by living in a given geographic location, and that's like terrible. That's like we need to be able to select different providers for different aspects. Otherwise, like you don't have competition and experimentation. So, I think that these cities are going to try out some relatively new stuff, but I also think that like new tokens and crypto systems like should probably be done independently.
Makes sense. Well, like I said, I will get in touch with you soon about episode 2, the money episode. I want to. We got one more question, so let me quickly get Joe. Joe, if you want to join us on screen, you'll need to turn on your camera.
All right. Thanks very
and
much for this.
Hang on a second. Let me add you to the screen. Yeah, go ahead.
I put a couple links in about Friedman's monetary proposals on the screen, and it was very much kind of a greenback approach, like Henry George. And the question I have for Patri is, with these different independent monies you're describing, how do you control inflation?
Well, it depends on the specific tokenomics of the system. Um, you know, if when you're doing, for example, stable coins that are denominated in some existing currency, you're just piggybacking off their inflation choices. Something like Bitcoin is a deflationary currency. Um, and then there are other cryptocurrencies that are inflationary, where they're minting new tokens, and then those go to like a predefined set of institutions, like the original core developers, and then maybe a grant-making organization where people who hold the token in the system vote in a DAO as to like what projects should get grants that they think will increase the value of this crypto system and ultimately increase the token. It's sort of like like a forced, like it's like inflation that funds making it better.
I appreciate that, but you already have the sovereign or the national currencies out there with a money supply that's supposed to be able to uh, facilitate the mean of exchange of full employment GDP, and now you're adding money to that supply. Wouldn't that be inflationary?
I I mean, yes, adding money to the supply is inflationary. Our current government in the US, for example, and in Europe seem to be massively inflationary, printing since 2008 like massive amounts of money. So if you have a crypto system that's like every year we're going to issue 3% new tokens and give them to the people working on making the system better, I think that would be much less inflationary than the US Federal Reserve, although obviously more inflationary than a fixed currency supply.
But they're still going to be they're still going to be operating and increasing the money supply as well. They're going to be doing their 3% or whatever it is.
Joe, if I could
Yeah,
interject,
okay,
we're
sure.
at the 2 hours. This is
That's
an
fine.
enormous subject that you just
Yeah.
opened, and like I said, I hope that Patri will join us for another episode where we can focus on exactly that, because it's
Sounds good.
such a big subject.
I'll do it just for fun, even though it's not my job.
All right, excellent. Well, I look forward to that. Patri, thank you so much. Like I said, longtime admirer of your work, and it was a treat to get um, to probe your brain a little bit, and I look forward to continuing the conversation. So
Thank
thank
you
you.
so much for having me.
All right, take care.
Bye.